DevelopSec, developing security awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of the DevelopSec podcast. This is James. As always, I apologize for the delay in getting this one out. I'd actually planned on this going out a week or so ago, but with Hurricane Irma coming up through, it kind of slowed some things down. So finally, a break from all the action that's been happening, and I got a chance to sit down and record this. The blog post that goes with this has been up for a little bit, but I did want to make sure we get the podcast out for all those that are listening to the podcast. And also, just a quick note, I've started on the YouTube channel that we have for DevelopSec, started converting the old podcasts that we've done to a video format that can be uploaded into YouTube. Now, there's no obvious video to this. It's still just audio. But if you know people that like to listen to things and they just rather go to YouTube and be able to listen versus going out and getting the podcast, I've got those. I started putting those up there and making them available. I've got the first 4 or 5 episodes, starting way back from when we started the podcast, up there and available for people to listen to if you'd like to listen that way. Feel free, have at it. I think it's a good chance to be able to also go back and look at some of the topics we've covered over the past few years and review them. Good chance to be able to go back and think about some of the stuff we've talked about. It's been a long time. We've covered a lot of topics. I mean, we're in the 80s for episodes, so that's a lot of information. There may be some stuff that's worth reviewing back there, so definitely go and check that out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes to where you can get to that YouTube channel. Subscribe if you like it, but it is a good way to be able to, just another medium to be able to access the information that we're providing here. So this episode, we want to talk about cross-site scripting, and we've talked about cross-site scripting before, but I'm going to talk about it in a little bit different angle, one that we don't see as much, but it's definitely something we want to think about. And in particular, we're talking about things like the anchor tag in HTML, right, where we have the HREF attribute. And this also carries over a little bit into like an iframe where there's a source attribute. So I was doing a test recently, and this came up, and I thought, you know what, we don't talk about this very often, so I want to take a chance to look at this. Because usually when we talk about cross-site scripting, we think about, just doing really HTML context. And we always talk context. There's lots of context to cross-site scripting, but we usually think about HTML. We think about attribute a little bit. We talk about JavaScript and URL and all these different places as well, but the main focus is typically on HTML and attribute. Well, HREF is an attribute, right? I mean, it's an attribute of an anchor tag, which defines where, when you click on that link, the page is going to take you. So typically when we think about attribute encoding, right, we want to make sure that we think about, can we break out of the href tag or that attribute within the anchor tag? That's often what we do when we're in attributes, right, is we try to break out. If you're delimited with double quotes, well, can I get a double quote into the value that I'm providing for the href and have it actually parse it as a double quote where it thinks it's the end delimiter, and then I can start adding my own attributes, or I can start adding my own other elements within the page. And that's usually what we think of when we think about attribute encoding. And breakout is, hey, what are our delimiters? How do we stop that from breaking out? So think of a scenario like this where I've got an application and I'm actually taking values off the query string and placing those into href tags and links, right? And so the idea behind it is this is kind of a breadcrumb, right? Okay, I've gone to an edit page and I want to go back, but I'm not sure where I came back from. So I pass it in the query string. The query string value is then passed into the href. And then so when I click back, it'll take me back to the page I came from. Interesting way to do it, right? I mean, not the most common way, I don't think, but it's a way that we can see we can do this. But we're taking that raw value and we're putting it down into the href. Okay, well, let's assume that we're not doing any type of attribute encoding. All right, so we don't encode delimiters or anything like that. Well, obviously, I can then take malicious code, put it in there. I can put the double quote in, and I get to add my own attributes. So we have cross-site scripting there, and this is the most common way we look at this. And so commonly what we see is we see the encoding being done for attribute encoding, so we can't break out of that attribute, right? I can't get out of the href tag, so I can't do anything with it. But here's the catch when we're talking about href, when we're talking about source. Now I'm talking source from an image, I'm talking source from like an iframe, or maybe even a frame set. I haven't tried a frame set, but definitely iframes this works as well. Even if I can't break out, I've done my attribute encoding, the href will actually execute JavaScript inside of it if we start the href value with JavaScript colon, all underscore, JavaScript colon, and then I can put JavaScript in there. So sometimes you'll see JavaScript colon void 0 put in there because we want to do something else when they click on that link. Maybe I want to raise an event and I want to run a function when somebody clicks that link instead of actually navigating to a page. Well, we can put JavaScript void 0 in there, right? And then on the onClick event, we can execute the code. And that void is saying, hey, don't navigate anywhere. Just kind of cancel that and then go ahead and execute whatever's in the onClick event. Okay, well, that works. But now we've just realized that we can put JavaScript into that href and I don't have to break out of that delimited string, right? I can stay within it. So, encoding my double quotes isn't going to do anything anymore because I'm not trying to get the site to redirect me any place. I'm trying to get it to execute code the way that the href is built to do that. So now, if I take that return URL or whatever parameter that we're passing, and I change that from a URL to JavaScript colon alert whatever, well, when I click on that link, it'll actually execute that JavaScript and pop the alert box. Now, obviously, alert's not very fancy, but it's showing that we can actually execute code within that context. So now we don't have to worry about trying to break out. So if we just did attribute encoding, that's not going to help us very much because we can still run JavaScript in that context. And this is something that's often overlooked, not only by development teams thinking, oh, well, we just do attribute encoding here. We forget that we can run the JavaScript in that, but also by testing teams because we forget that, oh, wait, I see this URL up here as a parameter and I need to make sure, hey, where is that going? Can I put JavaScript in there? A lot of times with parameters, we just try the breakout. We forget to try the execute JavaScript colon and then some JavaScript behind it. And it's really kind of an interesting feature because usually we see that as, oh, we can execute a statement. But you'd be surprised how much JavaScript you can actually embed into that href statement. It's not limited to one statement within JavaScript, right? You could actually write much more than that if you wanted to inside the href or that source attribute of an iframe. So we have to be really considerate of that. So how do we go about resolving this? Because obviously attribute encoding didn't work, right? Because, okay, we did quotes and double quotes, but I can write a lot of JavaScript without any of that. So that doesn't work. So how do we go about resolving this? Well, there's a few different things that we can think about as we consider to resolve this issue. Now, of course, it depends on what it is you're trying to do with that link and where that data is coming from. Don't forget data from the URL, that's untrusted, right? So we have to do something to it. So obvious, when we talk about encoding and we think about cross-site scripting, we always think about encoding. We could do the URL encoding. So when we do the URL encoding on that, right now the URL encoding will actually encode the colon that comes after JavaScript. And when that gets encoded, it actually breaks it. It won't execute the JavaScript in that. So we do want to think about making sure we have the URL encoding there. And since it is a URL, we probably want to have URL encoding on it anyway. But the URL encoding will actually break that JavaScript colon portion of that. Now remember, just because I URL encode it, that may not fix all my problems. So you may also need attribute encoding as well. There are situations where we need both. So just look at that as you're going through and thinking about this. But we definitely want to make sure that we're encoding data that we're putting out as output when it's untrusted input. Now, you could also implement content security policy if you're not already doing that. I know it may not be the easiest thing to implement, especially legacy systems where you haven't already broken things out and you have a lot of stuff embedded in the pages. But content security policy can help protect against that because it's not going to allow JavaScript to execute within the context of the page, right? It has to be on an external source, right? You can't embed the JavaScript in the page. You have to link out to it. So it doesn't allow that to work there. You could also validate the URL. Now, we're doing a breadcrumb type of functionality here, right? So when I click back, it takes me back to the page I came from. Well, you could create a whitelist of the pages that are going to be there that we allow to redirect back to. So you could do that. You could also validate that the page is relative and not an absolute, right? Making sure that things like it doesn't start with the word JavaScript. That can be a little tricky to try to figure out. So be cautious about doing stuff like that. But you can take that URL and check to see, hey, is this a well-formed URL? Is it a relative URL versus an absolute URL? Most likely, in this situation, we don't want to allow absolute URLs. We want to make sure it's relative. And to be fair, I haven't done the testing to see if I were to pass in JavaScript : to see if it would return back whether it's relative or absolute, or just say it's not a well-formed URL, something we'll do here in the future. But my guess is that it would not come back as a relative URL. So you can do that to make sure that, hey, I'm expecting an actual URL here, not JavaScript. Let's go through and make sure we do these checks to do that. You could also limit down to where you can return back to and say, look, I'm going to have a whitelist of URLs that we're going to support, and we're only going to allow putting those in. So maybe the parameter passes up some value, but you're comparing that saying, hey, does this match a page that we have? And that means start to end, possibly, saying, okay, if I'm going to return you back to register.aspx, well, then I just need to make sure, okay, if you passed up register.aspx, I'm going to compare that. Does that actually exist, right? Building that reference map. And then if it does, we'll take the value we have and we'll put that back down in there. So the page has supplied where it wants to return to, but we're going to check that against a list of valid locations they can return to. And then we're going to return the one from our list, not the one that was sent up through the query string. So that way we know we're not passing down untrusted data. We're passing down our data that's encoded in there. And of course, if it doesn't match any of the items that we've allowed in the whitelist, then we want to just return a default, go back to the home page or something like that. But also, I'm talking about, this is in the query string, all right? Just like when you go to log in and you see like a return URL there. Also, don't try to rely on things like the refer header, because we can manipulate the refer headers, right? So I could change those and potentially add JavaScript : into those if you're thinking about taking that and just putting it down there, right? All that data is untrusted data, so we don't want to do that. I mentioned this works also in the iframe source attribute as well. So something we just need to make sure we consider as we're developing our applications and we're taking data and we're putting it down into the page. Remember, if we're dealing with HREFs, if we're dealing with source, those type of things, they may support JavaScript using something like JavaScript : we also have data URLs where you can do data : and you can put some things in there. Remember that it supports that type of stuff and think about that. If you don't want to support that, make sure that you're basically disabling that by consciously blocking that type of data coming back down. Making sure that, hey, if I'm going to put something in HREF, it's an actual URL, not the ability to run JavaScript. We also want to make sure that we're limiting down that if I don't want them to be able to put a URL in that's going to take me to another site, that we're checking that to make sure that it is a relative site. When you're talking about from a testing standpoint, this again is something that we can do in QA to be able to test for this, right? If you're seeing URLs being passed as parameters, look to see where those are going. Right? A lot of times we think of open redirects when we see URLs. We might think of a server-side request forgery or something like that, where we have the URL and we can get it to pull a resource on the server that we didn't expect. But also, if that's coming back down into an HREF, or if that's coming back down into a source tag, that's also something we want to consider. And don't forget that we can do JavaScript colon in there to try to take advantage of cross-site scripting. And what's interesting about this is when you're dealing with the .NET app, and not .NET Core obviously, but .NET app where you have things like request validation that are enabled that don't allow you to do things like HTML context cross-site scripting, right? So I can't get less than characters in there, so I can't add my own elements. This bypasses that. This is, again, that reason why, hey, it's great we have that, and it helps a little bit, but it doesn't protect us from everything. And this is one of those kind of one-off cases of, wow, I can't believe this is right here, but it's so easy to miss because we forget to think, wow, I can't get out of it. It's encoding my data, but what if I tried doing something like a JavaScript colon? And to add on top of that, this is where it kind of gets interesting, especially from a testing side, right? When we look at, hey, what can I do with JavaScript when I'm inside and say I'm doing attribute encoding, right? Typically, your attribute encoding, they're encoding your double quotes, your single quotes, right? Those type of characters. Well, how do I get strings into my JavaScript? What if I want to alert a certain thing? What if I want to pull down another JavaScript file from an external source and try to load that onto the page? Okay, a lot of times we need to delimit our strings. We can't just leave them out there. And if you can't do single and double quotes, what do? Well, don't forget that a backtick also helps denote a string in JavaScript. And those typically are not encoded by your typical blacklist encoders, that do things like your attribute encoding. So without those being encoded, we have the ability to throw strings in there. We have the ability to do a lot of stuff, even though we're doing attribute encoding within that field, or we're doing some other encoding, or we're doing some other mitigation. So we want to be cautious of that. So remember that when you're testing and you see data is actually being plopped down into an HREF, if you control the front of that HREF, or you control the front of that source, try JavaScript colon alert and see if it'll actually let it alert the screen. Try some different things to see if it's there, and then take that information and be able to write that up and share it back with the development team and say, hey, here's what we've found. Here's the risks that we have. And then go back and look at the design. Look at what our expectations are for that functionality. Do we want the HREF to be able to execute JavaScript? Yes or no? If no, then we want to make sure that we're doing something to be able to make sure that's not going to execute. Whether that's, we have content security policy in place, although I wouldn't rely solely on that. We've got URL encoding on that data to make sure that it renders that stuff useless. We've got whitelisting. We're checking to see if it's an actual URL. We're forcing that it's a relative URL. There's all these things that we can be doing about this, but don't just go back and just add the encoding and be done. Go back and look at those fields and see what is your expectation for that link to be able to do something, and then go from there to go forward. So check out the blog post that's with this. I actually have a little bit more detail. It might be easier to see, where you can see like the different payloads and how they react in different scenarios. And check out, if you want to check out some of the back episodes, if it's been a while since you've heard some of these. I mean, what did we start back in like 2014? I mean, it's been a long time. Definitely check out the YouTube channel and see some of the episodes that are back out there now. You can re-listen to them while you're sitting at your computer. Always good. If you have questions or feedback, please send them to me. I've got some more stuff that I'm getting ready to record because lots of stuff going on, especially, you got the big deal going on with Equifax. Where we'll maybe have some discussion, not necessarily on Equifax itself, but some of the ideas that could help organizations hopefully kind of stay out of the breach highlight there and protect themselves. So lots of cool stuff coming in, but if you have questions or if you have thoughts that you want to share, please don't hesitate to share them with me. It's at DevelopSec on Twitter, or you can get me at Jardine Software on Twitter, or you can reach out to our website, developsec.com, or shoot me an email, james@developsec.com. Lots of ways to get in touch. Feel free to write out. I love having feedback and starting conversations. So I appreciate everybody listening. Hopefully, everybody listening out there and everybody else, you made it through the multiple hurricanes that have been going through the southern United States recently. And, you're getting back on your feet and everything's going well. So thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you on the next episode. You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.